Well, everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Canadian Immigration Podcast. This is our first introductory episode in a series that we're calling Time's Up. And essentially, this episode, the intro, Time's Up, what to do when your work permit is expiring, will kick off this new series that Alicia and I are going to be doing that is specifically targeted to you international students, you foreign workers, you post-grad work permit holders, those of you who are in Canada as temporary residents right now, hoping that you have an opportunity for permanent residence, but in all likelihood may very well not. So we're going to talk about the things in this series that are just not being discussed. And there's realities that we want to share with people. We want to talk about the options. Absolutely. As Canadian immigration lawyers, we want to be able to share insight on the various legal options for you to be able to remain in Canada. But we also want to be real about the challenges and the things that happen when you make the decision to stay illegally. And also talk about the advantages in some instances of choosing to go home. So Alicia, this is going to be a behemoth topic for us. As a podcast, but one that I think is well timed right now.
Yeah, there are a lot of people right now who are facing the end of the road. They're looking at their work permit expiry date. It's getting closer and closer, and things are really, really difficult in the Canadian immigration landscape right now. It's difficult politically. There's a lot of uncertainty, and people are having a hard time trying to get those invitations to apply under express entry. The PNPs are starting to get full, and it's hard to go to an employer and try to get an employer to get an LMIA, especially because of the tightening of measures with respect to low-wage LMIAs that have just come out.
And that's the big issue. In the past, everyone, we would always say, look, go to your employer, ask them if they will be able to get a labor market impact assessment for you. But the reality is there are so many people working on open work permits right now for employers. And with these new restrictions, the vast majority of low-wage positions, which many of you are in, and many of you, immigration lawyers and consultants, your clients are in these positions that fall below the median wage in those provinces. Those low-wage positions are capped at 10%. Now, there's some exceptions, yes, but only to 20%. And, there are some areas like agriculture that also are somewhat exempt. But the reality is, for the vast majority of people, even if your employer wanted to support you, there may not be an option because of the caps. So where does this lead us? The current landscape, Alicia, maybe you can just touch briefly on where we're at right now. Now, like I said, this is the beginning. We will, in future episodes, we will drill down a lot deeper on these topics. We'll pull out statistics. We'll pull out research that's been done. This will be a much more comprehensive series that we really hope will benefit people and give them a real opportunity to make decisions. But can you talk, you've mentioned a little bit about the landscape, kind of where we're at, but maybe you can flush that out just a little bit more.
Mm-hmm. And so, as many people know, COVID was a tough time for Canada, and we had a lot of people that couldn't leave. Legitimately, the borders were closed; they couldn't leave. And so, during that time, the government started extending all sorts of temporary public policies. And what happened, of course, was in the past and historically, Canada has never had restrictions on the number of temporary residents that could be in Canada. And that includes visitors, it includes students, it includes workers. And so we had a large number of people who just weren't able to leave. And then there was a labor market need for them to remain here. And so lots of those people started having extensions, and we had all these post-grad work permit 18-month. They weren't really extensions, they were actually temporary public policies, but things kept getting longer and longer for people's work permits. And then eventually the landscape started shifting. And now we're looking at housing crisis starts to come into the news. And now we're looking at unemployment rates that are changing. And now we're looking at different things with supply and demand. And so the politics, the economics, the situation in Canada starts shifting, and the government policies start shifting as well. And so the Liberals acknowledge, we've probably allowed those temporary resident numbers to balloon too big. And of course, there's also been a lot of changes with respect to study permits. And incidents of certain types of schools that are just trying to get a whole bunch of profit off of international students without necessarily having the highest quality programming behind it. And so then there's a crackdown on study permits as well. And so what ends up happening now is we have a levels plan for permanent residents. That has not changed. But now we have a limited number of spots for those PR levels plan numbers. And so what's happening now is there are a lot of people inside of Canada whose permits are coming to an end, and there is no temporary public policy that's going to save them this time. There is no magical extension that's coming down the pipes. And I think it's really important for people to understand that they are now at a critical decision point.
Yes. And it's interesting too, Alicia, as we talk about this current landscape for years, it's been years now, 3 years at least, maybe longer, since I've been telling people, look, you need to move out of Ontario and British Columbia. There are not enough spots to go around in those provinces. With over 50% of the international students going to Ontario, those options just were no longer available. And so people listened. And when you think of the current situation in Alberta, for years, the Alberta Advantage Immigration Program had our Alberta Opportunity Stream that was open, and it was one of the most broadly accepting programs, regardless of occupation tier, skilled, low skill, high wage, low wage. There were many opportunities because there were simply not as many people vying for those spots. And now we're in a world where Alberta looks now like British Columbia and Ontario. We have a new expression of interest system that was just released. And the previous podcast, we talked about that. And so we're in a situation where there just is not enough spots to go around. And just to add to my earlier comment, any place, any region that has 6% unemployment or higher, employers can't even get a labor market impact assessment. So yes, there's the 10% cap in areas where there is not a high unemployment rates. But to put things into perspective, if I look at Alberta, and I just pulled up some of the recent statistics from September 8th until, well, it says effectively October the 12th of 2024. But for August of 2024, you look, Calgary was 7.5, Edmonton was 8.5. If I shift to Ontario, there are very few places in Ontario that are not above 6. Kingston 6.4, Toronto's 8. You get you go into Quebec, even Montreal is 6.9. Trois-Rivières is 6.8. Shift to Nova Scotia and the Maritimes, those provinces, I don't think I have a region here where it's not above 6. And so this is going to create just really, really challenging situations for employers and for the foreign workers that are there. So we're now at a situation where I haven't looked at the most recent numbers, but we're talking about hundreds of thousands of people, Alicia, right now that have allowed themselves to fall out of status. And when I say out of status, they are illegal. In other words, they do not have a valid permit, and they could be in a period where they could restore that status if it's been within 90 days. But with the time as it passes, more and more people are going to fall outside of it. And one of the problems that I think, one of the things that's exacerbated this is those post-grad 18-month policies that were issued, because they retroactively saved a lot of people previously who had fallen out of status and allowed themselves to fall out of status, and then they were saved. And the reality now is that these people are not going to be saved. So let's dive in a little bit more about these consequences of becoming out of status. And what does it even mean, Alicia, to be out of status or illegal in Canada?
And so if you are not a Canadian citizen or a Canadian permanent resident, everybody else is categorized as a foreign national. And a foreign national has to have some valid authorization to be in Canada. And some people, depending on your country of nationality, are going to require a visitor visa. They are visa required because of their nationality. Some people only require what's called an electronic travel authorization, but either way, they need some ability to enter and remain in Canada. Once you're here, that TRV only allows you to visit. It doesn't allow you to work. It doesn't allow you to study. And that's really important. So if you also need to work or study while you're here in Canada, assuming you have valid visitor status, either an ETA or a visa, then you also would need to go and have a valid work permit or a study permit if you're studying, or have some other authorization under the Act that enables you to work or to study without a permit. And there are very limited circumstances where that's possible. So if your permit, if you, let's say you came in 2022, and normally people are issued a study permit. Let's say they did a program for 2 years, it went for 2024. They would have to, before that study permit expires, make a decision. Are you going to apply for a postgrad work permit? Are you eligible for a postgrad work permit? Are you going to apply for another study program if that's something that you're transitioning to, or are you going to go home? So, for example, if somebody's permit is expiring, they have to take action before the expiry of that permit to extend it or to change their status. So, if they fail to do that and that permit expires, now they are without status. And just like you were saying, Mark, it is possible in certain circumstances to ask for restoration, but 90 days is your key. So, making sure that you are not longer than 90 days from whatever date is the expiry date on your permit.
And there are consequences to this, you guys. There are consequences to becoming illegal in Canada. And the challenge that most people right now, I think, are facing is that there are some employers that are willing to pay people under the table and pay them cash. And on the surface, there is this perception, well, if I can just hold on a little bit longer, maybe something will happen. And there was a rumor going around, and that was attributed to Minister Miller, that they were considering somewhat of an amnesty for some workers that had fallen out of status. But I can tell you that the likelihood of that happening at this stage is extremely low. And so people who are or have made the decision or are considering just staying, there's some things that you need to understand. And one of them is that when you choose to do that, immediately you lose options in the future. The moment you become out of status to the point where you can't restore, then you are no longer eligible to apply for a new work permit, for example. If your employer is able to get a labor market impact assessment, I guess I shouldn't say you're prevented. You just can't do it from within Canada. And if you have shown an unwillingness to comply temporarily, and then you do go home, there's a far greater likelihood your work permit will be refused in the future. And Alicia and I are going to dive into a lot of this a lot deeper. But even when it comes to the employers that you associate with, if there's an employer who's willing to employ you under the table and pay you cash, I can guarantee they're not going to adhere to employment standards, and that they're likely not going to be paying you the wage that you should be earning. They may not even pay you minimum wage. They may not pay you overtime. So all of those protections that exist as a valid a worker in valid status on a valid work permit, when you can go to employment standards, many of those protections that are in place will be gone. And yeah, Alicia, go ahead.
And I wanted to add to that too, the practical reality, Mark, is as soon as somebody's work permit or study permit expires, now you're no longer eligible to hold a social insurance number. And so you no longer have usually the ability to have any sort of benefits, and you can't prove that you have the ability to work legally. And normally your driver's license will be tied to the duration of your work permit, and also your healthcare, provincial healthcare coverage. So all those things come crashing down. You no longer have your social insurance number, you no longer have your healthcare coverage, and you no longer have the ability, usually in most provinces, to legally drive. And these combination of factors make life very precarious.
Yes. And one other thing we want to point out is that you will more than likely be living in poverty in Canada. You will have no ability to have any upward mobility in companies. It will be extremely unlikely that promotions and things like that will happen, because the employers who are willing to do this are they themselves exposing themselves to liability and sanctions if it's discovered. And so there's tremendously risky employment options for you. Well, they're limited. And the impact you also have to understand if you choose to remain in Canada beyond the validity of your stay. Canada has agreements, information sharing agreements with many other countries, the UK, Australia, New Zealand, and the United States. And if you have shown non-compliance in Canada, the ability you may have in the future to go to another country can be seriously harmed. And the reality is many countries, even outside of those, will ask the question, have you complied or, with visa requirements in other countries? And obviously the expectation is you're going to answer truthfully. And when you do that, that can also limit your ability to go to other countries. So we're going to dive into this in a lot more depth in a future episode, but we just wanted to highlight it today. And so be aware, there's consequences for staying illegally. Do not expect that the minister is going to save you and just create this amnesty. Do not believe anyone that is telling you that, especially if you're relying upon that as the only reason for you to remain. So,
And
yeah.
I want to pick up, Mark, on what you said there too. So understand that any employer, any Canadian employer who is going to be employing a foreign national has to know that you are validly authorized to work. It's an offense for an employer actually to employ anybody without authorization to work. They can go to jail. It's actually a criminal offense. So there's jail time in addition to significant financial penalties. So the instant that you have some employer who doesn't care whether you have a valid work permit, run the other way.
Absolutely. Okay. So we've tried to do our best just initially here to scare you a little bit. And for you consultants and immigration lawyers out there, these are discussions you have to have with your clients. And obviously, one of our roles as representatives is to present the options. And Alicia, let's shift now and just talk to some of the most common things that happen when someone's work permit is expiring. And let's talk about extending your stay. And obviously, each of these areas are episodes in and of themselves. But at this stage, let's start. Where do you want to start when it comes to staying?
Yeah, I mean, I think making sure that people understand what their options are is absolutely critical. So if you don't know what your options are, please don't bury your head in the sand because that is not going to help you. So if your work permit is running out, then sometimes it is possible to try to extend that work permit, and that might be your best option. It is usually rare that you can extend a work permit if you are coming to the end of an open postgrad work permit, because that's a one and done. So you only get one postgrad work permit, and if you've used it up, it's over forever. So you'll have to look for another category of work permit that you might be eligible for. And this is really, really important. And most of the time, if you have a permanent residence application that has been accepted under your acknowledgement of receipt, you've actually submitted it and it's in process. In some circumstances, you can look at doing bridging work permits. Sometimes those are open bridging work permits, meaning it's not specific to an employer, but sometimes those are closed work permits. And a lot of people go wrong at this point because they don't understand the difference between a closed bridging work permit and an open bridging work permit. So if you can switch to a different or a new category of work permit status, that very well may be your best option.
Yeah. And remember, any of you out there who have at least a CLB 5 in your French language ability, you can possibly apply for a Francophone mobilité work permit. And obviously, most people that have worked and been studying and trying to increase their French language are aware of this. But like I said, one of the things we do obviously within our firm is we help to analyze possible options that, scouring through all of the various immigration work permits through the International Mobility Program to see if there is something that might work. International treaties that we have with other countries sometimes, depending on your nationality. So, so that's one of the things that we do. But if it's not available, Alicia, if someone doesn't have another work permit to transition to, there's no LMIA, they're under a cap, or there's higher than 6% unemployment or 6% or higher, then what's next?
Mhm. So another option could be, and this is a very limited option now, to try to get a study permit, right? Some people would try to shift from a work permit to a study permit. But especially if you're on a postgrad work permit, it's a poor option in most cases to ever try to go back for a study permit. You're never going to get another PGWP. And now we have provincial attestation letters and we have caps on students. So that is probably not a good option for most people to try to transition to a study permit. The other thing would be to try to transition to visitor status. So if you are here as a worker or a student and your time's up, you can't find another job, you can't find another legal way to change to working, some people say, you know what, I have enough points. I'm in the express entry pool. I think it's a matter of time before I'm going to get my invitation to apply. Maybe I'll just hang out in Canada for a little bit. I have enough savings to be able not to work in Canada, and that is key because if you're here as a visitor, you cannot work. You cannot enter the labor market. You could simply just sit here and stay as a visitor if you can prove a valid temporary intent.
Yeah. And remember, you cannot work. If you work while you're on visitor status, under the table, as we say, for cash or any other purpose, that is unauthorized. And visitor status allows you to stay physically in Canada, but you cannot study, you cannot work. So let's say someone has made the decision, well, I'm not going to do that, and they've fallen out of status. We've talked about restoration. So if you're within the 90 days, then we strongly encourage you not to just stay in that state and allow yourself to become illegal, but to file a restoration of status, at least as a visitor. If, yeah, go ahead, Alicia.
And just remember that the instant you fall out of status, you could be removed, right? It is possible for you to be removed right away. But normally, you will have that 90-day grace period within which to make an application for restoration. A lot of people don't realize, though, they have to restore to a certain type of status that they're eligible for. And you can only have certain types of violations that are eligible even for restoration. So if you've done something otherwise illegal, you may not even be eligible for restoration. If you are, you've got to get that application within 90 days and you have to make sure to pay that restoration fee. Otherwise, it's not a valid restoration application, and that's super important too.
Yeah. So let's say someone's beyond the 90 days now, Alicia. So we're talking to you all out there that are illegal right now. What options do they have to try to create some type of a temporary status in Canada? Is there any other options if you're beyond 90 days?
Yeah, so there is what's called a temporary residence permit, a TRP. And this is not the same as a TRV. This is not a temporary resident visa. This is a temporary resident permit. And this is what used to be called a minister's permit a long time ago. But it is some exceptional reason why you have to remain in Canada even though you're technically in violation of something. And it's pretty broad, but IRCC and officers don't like to give these out because they have to justify to the Canadian public why they're issuing TRPs every time they issue them.
And we will dive into TRPs as well, you guys. I'll give you an example of a couple that, well, one that was successful. So we had a client who himself had a Canadian spouse, and the intention was that they were going to proceed forward with spousal sponsorship, but that spouse had a lot of challenges. They ended up separating, and the foreign national had the children, but he didn't have the ability to extend his work permit. So he tried to continue extending his visitor status, but at the end of the day, it was refused. So he came to me after the 90 days. And in that case, we were able to apply for a temporary resident permit because his Canadian born children needed someone to care for them. And we were able to include a work permit application with that TRP to allow him to work while we pursued another avenue for PR, which we'll talk about in a second. But for temporary residents in this situation, the TRP, it has to be a highly, almost, I don't even know if you'd call it compassionate, but there has to be a real solid reason why they should grant a TRP, in spite of the fact that you don't, or you're not eligible for what you're asking for. In this case, it was a work permit. But this
Yeah.
type of a thing, we'll definitely dive more into it. But that's just to give one example of the real extreme circumstances that are required in order to be successful with a TRP. Some
And
justification.
and what you said there too is really important, Mark, because a TRP itself doesn't authorize you to work. So a TRP just gives you the ability to stay in Canada even if you're illegal for some reason or unauthorized or not meeting the requirements of the Act. However, only a TRP that's longer than 6 months could potentially be the basis for you to also apply for that work permit. So there's a lot of fine tuning that needs to happen if you're looking at a TRP to save you.
Yes. So these are all things we're talking about that are focused on temporary status. So how to maintain it, how to restore it, potentially using the highly discretionary TRP. But at the end of the day, you still don't have a pathway to permanent residence. And so Alicia talked about some situations where people know they're close, they could get an ITA, but it just hasn't happened yet. So they're just buying their time. Well, some people do not have a shot. They know it. And so you will hear a lot of this, you guys. You will hear a lot of talk about these options that we're going to present right now. But once again, you really have to be careful with your decision to proceed forward with these. People will take advantage of you. People will encourage you to file when you really do not have a foundation for it. And it will only drain your bank account further and result in you being worse off when ultimately you have to go home in any event. So let's start with the first one, Alicia, and that's the HNC application, the humanitarian and compassionate application.
And so now we're looking at possible pathways for permanent residence. And these are not ones that you want to enter into lightly. And these are not ones that you want to abuse ever. So a humanitarian and compassionate application is one under Section 25 of the Act where, for some reason, there are compelling circumstances that make your case usually something out of the ordinary that would cause a common person to have their heart go out to that situation and want to try to relieve your suffering. A big part of them is normally the best interests of the children. And so those can be Canadian children. They can also be children that are non-Canadian. But the best interest of the child is paramount to an agency application, as well as compelling circumstances that would cause somebody to feel compassion towards your situation. Normally has to be things outside of your control. If you have simply allowed yourself to fall out of status and you want somebody to save you, this is not the right kind of application by and large.
No. And like I said, we will dive into this a lot deeper. We're just tossing these out as, things to think about and consider. I'll give you an example with an agency that was successful. So we had a client who applied for permanent residence. In this case, they were not out of status. They had a valid LMIA-based work permit, but they applied for a TR to PR pathway program back in the day. They did not realize that the school that they went to that was not a post-grad eligible school resulted in them being ineligible for the TR to PR program. So the application was submitted under the international student category. But in the end, IRCC sent basically a procedural fairness letter to the client saying, hey, we don't think you're eligible. And so we provided humanitarian and compassionate arguments saying, look, this individual from the Philippines has family back there. She's got sisters that have children, that she's sending money to them so they can go to school. They've got better medical care. And that was a huge part of the application for this woman. Obviously, her inadmissibility or her ineligibility for the program was very technical, a small little technicality. She was working, she had employer support, she was involved in their community, all these kinds of things. And in the end, obviously, the best interests of the child, the BIOC factors, were a really strong factor in that application being approved. But these are the kinds of things that you're looking for, not just, I don't want to go home, or, we've mortgaged our family farm back in India so that I could get my education. And, if I go back, I need to be here. You really have to come up with some very solid arguments to justify. And compassion is a factor. Like Alicia said, family relationships are a factor. But at this stage anyways, H&C is one of those things that people will be pushing on you, and you need to make sure you understand and stay tuned. We'll definitely have an episode covering this. Now,
Mm-hmm.
on the family relationship topic, Alicia, we have to
Uh-huh.
bring this up. We have to bring this up.
Yep. Yep.
You know where I'm going with this?
Yep.
Couples,
So, yep.
spousal sponsorship.
I hear this all the time, right? I hear this all the time where people say, "Oh, you know what? I've been here. I've studied here. I met my girlfriend here, and now we've been in a relationship. I don't know if we're going to get married, but their work permit now is running out, and they decide, well, maybe we better get married. Maybe my significant other is going to sponsor me to come to Canada." And this has, you know, alarm bells going off in the background because immigration has a definition of what a marriage of convenience is. And as soon as you have a marriage that any part of your motivating factor was for immigration purposes, it is now deemed to be a marriage of convenience. It is deemed to be non bona fide, something that is not genuine. So even if you have been together with this person for years and you end up staying together and you have a kid together, um, if the reason for you getting married in the first place was to save your immigration status, immigration can come back and say, we're never going to give you a sponsorship. We're never going to approve your PR. And you will forever not be a member of the family class and eligible for sponsorship if that's what they find.
So be advised. This is a key factor when it comes to spousal sponsorship. If this is something that you fully intended to do, it's the natural course of your relationship as it evolves, then absolutely. A sponsorship is something that can fix even being out of status. And that's why it sometimes becomes an option people consider, one of those round pegs in a square hole where they try to wedge themselves in, because it can overcome someone who is completely out of status. And we've got clients that have been in that situation where they were sponsored by their spouse in Canada, and the only reason for them, the only non-compliance with the act is that they were out of status. We were successful in securing permanent resident status for them, but this is an avenue that has very, very narrow exceptions, and just be careful. All right. The final one, Alicia. This is, and I
Yeah.
shouldn't say final because, there's always opportunities depending upon the unique circumstances of people, but this is another one that on the surface seems like a great idea because of the benefits that flow from it initially. But in the end, it is a crushing barrier to progress. And that is filing a refugee claim or an asylum claim. So
Yeah.
let's talk about this one.
So making a refugee claim is not something that you would ever do unless you understand what the definition of a refugee is. And I think most people don't realize how serious it is as soon as you make a refugee claim. So the instant you make a refugee claim, you are actually no longer admissible and no longer following the rules, because as soon as you make a refugee claim as a temporary resident, you're saying that you don't meet all the requirements for a normal permanent resident stream, but you are asking to stay permanently. And so what happens is they literally take away your passport. They take away your documents, they give you ineligibility documentation, which then will take effect upon the end of the determination of your hearing. And so literally you lose everything that you had pending whatever happens in your refugee determination process. And you are no longer eligible to make economic permanent residence applications. So the instant you do that, you close a number of doors. The other thing that people should really be aware of is convention refugee status or person in need of protection are defined terms under the Act. And there are a lot of factors that have to go into whether you are being persecuted on an enumerated ground. This is not just because there is a war in your country. You have to be persecuted on an enumerated ground. And we can talk more about that later. But it's things like race, gender, ethnicity, political opinion, all sorts of things that are very specific. And you have to prove that you specifically are being targeted, that your government cannot protect you, that there's no internal flight alternative. You can't go somewhere within your own country to find safety. You don't have citizenship or the ability to go to another country. Um, and that this is a reasonable and personalized fear as well. So there are a lot of moving parts to a refugee claim. It can't just be because there was a breakdown in your home country. It has to be something specific to the definition of convention refugee or a person in need of protection.
Yes. Okay, so those are basically at a very high level some of the main things that people look at when time is up. Now, let's talk about what we are advocating people do when time is up, and that is to go home. And when going home is the best option, that's really what I want to focus on right now. When you think about leaving voluntarily, it can actually be a strategic move. Now, one of the past episodes that I did a video on the advantages of going home and gaining more work experience. Some of you who have never worked overseas, have never worked in your home country, came to school at a young age and then transitioned to postgrad and have Canadian work experience. You may be leaving express entry points on the table. And when you go back, work for a year, you may find that your points increase. And under the Canadian experience class, or one of the general draws, you have the likelihood of, with those increased points, maybe pushing you over the top where you can then come back. And remember, for the Canadian experience class, they're only looking for 1 year in the previous 3 years to be eligible. So there's still time to go back, work for a year, and then potentially get those extra points and get drawn under CEC, even if that is the case when you're not in Canada. So, voluntarily leaving, there are practical reasons why it may be a strategically good move for qualifying and increasing your chances of obtaining permanent residence. But leaving that aside, there are other benefits. We talked about, complying with immigration laws, how it preserves the opportunity for you to come back to Canada or even go to another country. We'll flush into those in future episodes. But there are also benefits of returning home and taking what you've gained here in Canada, aren't there, Alicia?
Mm-hmm. And yeah, I mean, what you say there, Mark, is so important. Like being honest on your future immigration applications is absolutely essential. They will know if you overstayed.
Yeah, absolutely they will. And the interesting thing too is when you show that you have gone to Canada, you've complied, you've abided by your temporary status, you are going to be a more compelling approval when it comes to applying, say, to the US or to the UK or to Australia if there are other opportunities that arise there. And then when you go home, understand that, one of the things we're going to talk about a little bit more in future episodes is taking that Canadian education, taking that Canadian work experience and leveraging it for better opportunities in your home country. Now, we get it. We understand that the earning power, of a job in Canada to pay for a Canadian education is often much better than to go home and then try to leverage that education and the cost of what that schooling was. We get it. But the reality is when you've taken foreign education and you go back to many countries, it's well respected. And there's often opportunities for jobs and we're not telling you guys things that you don't know already, but opportunities for upward advancement in companies and internationally that you may, because of the Canadian education and work experience, that you may never have otherwise had. And it makes you more competitive for advancement and for promotions. And there's lots of international companies that work and that operate in countries all over the world. And you could very well have an opportunity to even come back to Canada on an intercompany transfer work permit or something like that. So it's all about keeping as many options open as possible and not closing things off. So there we have it, Alicia. This is very high level discussion, and we are going to flush all of this out in our Time's Up series. We encourage you to subscribe to the podcast. Come join us over on the Canadian Immigration Institute. We're going to be talking about these things in future videos, as well as our live Q&As as we watch this unfold in real time. All right. Thanks, Alicia, for joining, and we will see you guys in our next episode.